July 2003, Teen Titans came out. 2 years later, in February 2005, Avatar: The Last Airbender released its first episode. And I think I'm not alone in stating that these two cartoons not only existed in, but were driving forces behind a shift in cartoons. Around this time, it became more common for cartoons to have overarching stories, not just episode-to-episode plots that were inconsequential. By no means were Teen Titans and Avatar the first cartoons to focus more on overarching plot, but they were two of the first to popularize this kind of storytelling in Western animation. After all, if you want to talk about overarching plot, anime is no stranger to the concept, which is probably why you've heard that Teen Titans and Avatar lean heavily into anime as an influence. Narrative-driven shows benefit greatly from being macro-planned as opposed to micro-planned. When a show has the big picture set up since episode 1, all the way to the finale, the overarching plot and consistencies will be better. If a show is micro-planned, then the moment-to-moment writing will be better, individual episodes easier to throw on without context. Essentially, most narrative-driven shows are macro-planned, and most episodic shows are micro-planned. Then we have RWBY. We don't talk about RWBY. So if one isn't better than the other, why are we seeing more and more cartoons stray from an episodic approach? Again, I'm from the US, so cartoons used to exist in a binary. Either they were made for young kids or adults. Cartoons for adults often relied on vulgar humor, and cartoons for children on force-fed lessons. And while cartoons have started to build an audience of all ages, their driving force being the lesson we learned along the way hasn't disappeared. In old shows, like the original He-Man and She-Ra, a character would have to stare into the screen and tell the children at home exactly what they learned from that episode.
In today's story, He-Man used something even more powerful than his muscles to beat Skeletor. You know what it was? If you said his brain, you were right.
When I was a kid, this was still done, just more subtly. Now, I think cartoons trust that the lesson is obvious enough that summarizing it at the end of the episode is pointless. Writers are starting to trust children's ability to analyze and interpret. So not only are writers trusting children's ability to interpret lessons without them being stated, but they're trusting children's ability to interpret them from larger ideas, not just what can fit into 20 minutes. Teen Titans and Avatar go about this in two different ways. For one, it's obvious that Avatar was completely planned in its entirety before episode 1 was even released. Teen Titans, on the other hand, approached overarching plots through its season-to-season focuses, with some callbacks to previous seasons as well. And while Teen Titans was still ahead of its time with exploring larger narrative, it was still more episodic. Once again, not a bad thing. Teen Titans was a classic 5 seasons and a movie, and pulled away from being completely tied to the DC universe, having the characters exist almost solely within themselves and their hero identities, for the most part. If you're a fan, then you may know that the episode 1 depends on official order and release order. It can be either Divide and Conquer or Final Exam. Either way, the story sets up for Slade, the big baddie that is PG-13 Deathstroke. And while he is the main villain, each season has a different villain focus that introduces itself earlier in the season, then comes back for a 2-part finale that primarily focuses on one Titan. Unless you're Starfire, then you're robbed. But the fact that context is required for these finales makes it obvious that, to some extent, the villains in Teen Titans are overarching as well. Season 1 we have Slade, then he comes back and it's Slade versus Robin. Then we have Terra, and it's Terra versus Teen Titans, heavy on Beast Boy. Then we have Brother Blood, and then Brother Blood comes back and it's versus mostly Cyborg with some Titans and Titansies sprinkled in. Then we have Raven being all angsty about her demon daddy, then he comes back and she hogs most of this season's screen time with her angst, as any best girl should. Final season starts and ends with 2-parters, both Beast Boy and Brotherhood of Evil focused. Sorry Starfire, at least you get to be on the cover of one of the DVDs. 5 Titans, 5 seasons. I'm no mathematician, but this seems off. Anyway, the episodes between these larger plots are pretty self-contained, but this isn't a guarantee. If you've never watched an episode of SpongeBob before, you can still put on almost any episode and follow well enough. But if you turn on Season 3, Episode 2 of Teen Titans, you'd be a little confused about who Red X is. It's not as confusing as if you were to pick a random episode of Young Justice, God no, but Young Justice came out when cartoons were already down this path. When I was younger and watched whatever the fuck episode happened to be on Cartoon Network that day, I was sometimes a little lost when it came to Teen Titans. That's another reason I think narrative shows are becoming more popularized. Being able to watch shows in serial order now is much easier with streaming services and other websites. Not to sound like a grandma, but back in my day, if you wanted to watch something that wasn't currently on TV, you had to look it up on YouTube. It would be on someone's shaky, home-recorded video of their own TV screen with their kids screaming in the background, and it would be divided into 27 1-minute parts with parts 19 to 23 mysteriously missing. But that's why I think Teen Titans was ahead of its time, because kids needed to have seen a decent amount of the episodes to pick up on some of the lessons. Of course, some episodes had a one-and-done lesson like,
once you accepted your fear, you regained control over it.
Or,
my body may have its limitations, but if I put my mind to it, there's no limit to what I can do.
But each Titan also had larger overarching lessons they had to learn along with the audience. You probably wouldn't pick up on the fact that Robin has teamwork issues despite being a leader from 1 or 2 episodes. But if you've seen the whole series, then it's something you pick up on. Starfire proving that her optimism is not weakness is also a message that is strongest if you've seen all of her focused episodes. Cyborg's struggle to balance man and machine is approached in numerous ways, each one with surprising nuance for a cartoon aimed at young children. And now, with Teen Titans Go, it's 100% episodic, and the lessons aren't really meant to be taken seriously. Once again, that's fine. Episodic shows like Teen Titans Go and Gumball are still hilarious. And Avatar did what Teen Titans did, but dialed up to 100. Because while each season has a somewhat contained arc, each of these seasons' plots all lead up to the major finale, Sozin's Comet. You learn about this early on. The end goal, since the beginning, is for Aang to fight Ozai and defeat the Fire Nation. Because Avatar's finale was planned out since the first episode, there are no awkward gaps, no plot holes. The only thing that feels incomplete was the whole thingy thing with Zuko's mom, and I genuinely believe it's because the writers felt there was no way to really add in that whole storyline without it drawing away from the main narrative. And if Avatar's focus on narrative is Teen Titans on Turbo Mode, so too are their use of lessons. Sure, you may watch an individual episode and feel like you've learned a fun lesson.
Do you really think friendships can last more than one lifetime? I don't see why not.
Well, scientifically speaking, there's no way to prove that.
Oh, Sokka, just hold hands.
But most of the themes the show is trying to get across to the audience exist beneath the surface, in the cracks between episodes and seasons. There are so many different approaches to forgiveness, to family, to pain, to strength. And these are just the personal lessons. Avatar also touches on larger lessons, some of which I didn't really pick up on as a 7-year-old. Like how a lot of the times, people don't realize their nation is the oppressor.
The air nomads didn't have a formal military. Sozin defeated them by ambush.
Well, I don't know how you could possibly know more than our national history book.
Or how forgiveness is never owed, but earned, and never necessary.
Forgiveness is the first step you have to take to begin healing. But I didn't forgive him. I'll never forgive him. But I am ready to forgive you.
This show is surprisingly dark considering its demographic, but hey, they still included the trademark silly jokes of any cartoon. And that's what impresses me. The show is so upbeat despite how heavy its content can get. And this type of heavy content can't be granted in episodic shows, because if you keep wrapping up your issues at the end of each episode, they can't build upon one another. They can't develop or expand. And you see this with Netflix-era cartoons like Kipo and She-Ra, where at times, the end of one episode and the beginning of the next are difficult to differentiate. I remember when Season 5 of She-Ra and the Princesses of Power dropped, my brother and I watched it in one sitting, and if you take out the intro song, which God, I could never do, then it kind of feels like one long movie. However, if I put on Fairly Odd Parents and plowed through a whole season, it wouldn't flow at all, and that's not how it's meant to be watched, so that makes sense. And if Avatar's setup has led to shows like She-Ra, Infinity Train, and Kipo, then Teen Titans' setup has led to shows like Glitch Tex and Hilda. The Owl House feels somewhere in between these two narrative setups. Either way you slice the pizza, shows are starting to focus on the larger picture. 1, because streaming services have made watching shows in its intended order much easier. 2, because writers are starting to trust children more as an audience. 3, because the binary of adult versus children as a cartoon's audience, in the US at least, has finally broken. And 4, and this one I'm pulling completely out of my ass, it seems like fanbases for cartoons are starting to look more like fanbases for larger fictional universes, meaning that as online accessibility to these communities grow, so too does the demand for lore, depth, and larger plot. I guarantee there are far less fan theories surrounding Jimmy Neutron than there are for shows with overarching narrative. And I don't know if these larger and more involved fanbases exist because of the shift towards narrative, or if the larger and more involved fanbases have caused a demand for them. Either way, writers, artists, and everyone else involved in these cartoons are now finding themselves much more involved than they were, and the stories they're creating are larger than I would have expected any cartoon to be when I was a kid.